Today on the show, we're taking a look at one of the most interesting and, quite honestly, complex plots in movies: time travel. From family classics to brain scratchers, time travel has been a part of pop culture since pop culture started. We're going to go back to the past and see where the groundwork for time travel plots came from. We'll take a look at some of the most famous examples of time travel in movies and see what it is about these films that people are captivated by. Do people love these movies because the time travel is so accurate, or is it just a backdrop for a brilliant plot? We'll also take a look at the films that have fun with it, the films that got it terribly wrong, and I'll try and talk about Primer. And as always, you can listen to the Behind the Screen podcast on Spotify. Hello and welcome back to the Behind the Screen podcast. My name is Goran and I'm joined here today by my good friend Nicholas Kosick from the Did Somebody Say Movies podcast. How are you doing, bud?
Hey, Goran, it's good to be back. I'm great. How are you?
Dude, I am great, and I am pumped about today's episode because we're taking a deep dive look into the world of time travel movies. And what's great about this topic is that time travel has been around in film for so long, but also in popular culture. I mean, the fact that H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine in 1895 shows that people have been wanting to go back in time since mistakes were invented.
I'm so excited.
So today we're going to take a look at how far back time travel really goes. We'll take a look at some of the bigger time travel films and see what it is about these films that just keep bringing us back. Lastly, we'll take a look at a mix of films that incorporate themes of time travel into the plot, whether repeating the same day over and over again or not even knowing if the time travel works. And as always, what better way to get started than with a couple of quickfire examples?
Woo! Quickfire. Love it.
In Pleasantville, we see Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon get transported back to a black and white 1950s utopia.
Tobey Maguire was in more than just Spider-Man?
In 13 Going on 30, we see Jennifer Garner leaping forward a few years. Nicolas Cage has the ability to see 2 minutes into the future in the film Neck.
If I could have any superpower, man, this would be it.
It would be to be Nicolas Cage. Army of Darkness brings Bruce Campbell all the way back to 1300 AD.
Great year.
And Hot Tub Time Machine has the words time machine right in the title.
It must be some kind of hot tub time machine.
And what's so interesting about not just these samples, but all the movies we're going to be talking about today is that there's no real concrete definition of what exactly a time travel movie is, let alone time travel. Some examples that we'll see will have an actual device that travels back in time. Some explain how it works, some don't. Some travel back in time just to the start of the same day over and over again. I think a big reason why so many people love time travel movies is that there's really no two movies that are alike. So at the start of the podcast, I brought up how H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine in 1895, which most people consider to be the first modern time travel story. Funny enough, H.G. Wells wrote an earlier time travel novel named The Chronic Argonauts in 1888. And not only that, but around the same time, Mark Twain puts out this satire piece called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. While it may seem like a Bug's Life / Ants thing was happening, the way the two told their stories were quite different. So you had H.G. Wells, and he would always try and include a why as to how the science fiction in his novels would be working. Likewise, he had Mark Twain, and he was way more interested in what the time traveler would do given the ability to go back in time, rather than see how he got there. And in his satire piece, A Connecticut Yankee Wakes Up in Camelot Times, the character's knocked out with a crowbar, which is literally the plot of the Martin Lawrence film Black Knight, if you haven't seen it.
We have a fresh horse ready for you, sire. The king awaits thee.
Horse?
You said you wanted to ride.
Yeah.
Are you serious? That sounds... This book sounds like the best plot ever.
And in the coming years, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court was adapted as a 1921 silent film, a 1931 talkie, and a musical in 1949. And in 1960, George Pal brought H.G. Wells' The Time Machine to life in a proper film adaptation. And this film ended up winning an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. Despite this, we didn't see any standout time travel films in the years to come. We had films like Slaughterhouse-5 and Planet of the Apes that, yes, they did have time travel as a plot device, but none of the central conflict was around the actual time traveling.
Right.
So what happened with time travel films? What exactly was it that introduced them so aggressively into popular culture? Well, two very important time travel films came out. The Terminator in 1984 and Back to the Future in 1985.
Okay, so Back to the Future is one of my favorite movie trilogies, I guess. I don't know. It's such a great idea, and everybody always quotes from those films. Marty McFly, Doc Brown. What is it? We gotta get it up to 88 miles per hour. Classic.
Make like a tree and get out of here.
That's a good one.
It's leave, you idiot. Make like a tree and leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong.
All right then.
Back to the Future is not only one of the best time travel film franchises, but it's one of the best film franchises in general of all time. I mean, these films are oozing with personality and humor, and they have so many memorable set pieces. And not only that, but I really don't think that there's a property that, while this isn't the biggest property, it's probably the most well-received across the board.
I'd say so.
It's probably also the only time travel movie where the actual machine is the most famous part of the film itself. And the thing about Back to the Future is that the time travel isn't exactly all too carefully explained. Instead, it's shown that this specific car can program a date and drive there. And we see elements of time travel negatively affecting Marty in the film. But again, when you think of Back to the Future, time travel's in the name of it. All the iconography, you know, the DeLorean, everything's
Right.
all about the time travel aspect in that.
Exactly.
The time travel in the film isn't exactly grounded. I mean, the plot itself of them going back and forth in timelines, it's set on one timeline, so anything you do on it will affect it, and you're basically bouncing back and forth and trying to fix everything on the same timeline.
Right. Science.
In Back to the Future, what ends up happening to Marty as the film goes on? He has a picture of his family, he's playing at the dance, and his
Yeah.
dad's not going to dance with his mom. And do you remember what happens to Marty as he's playing?
Yeah, he starts, I can't remember if he starts to disappear or him in the photo starts to disappear, but either way, he starts to disappear.
Exactly. We start to see that Zemeckis was kind of taking a bit of leeway in terms of how the time travel mechanics work in this world. I mean, we'll see later on that some time travel mechanics happen instantaneously, but again, much like Twain, I think that Zemeckis was focusing more on creating an exciting story with these unbelievable elements rather than this 100% accurate time travel movie.
Exactly.
If someone vanishes from a photograph, like, does the memory of that person fade? Like, why would this picture in the frame not change entirely rather than just like one person fading away? I mean, there are moments in the franchise where people meet each other, which a lot of people will suggest would just like disrupt whatever's causing time travel to work, and we'd all kind of just implode. And it's funny how despite everyone turning to Back to the Future as this quasi time travel movie, the time travel in the film itself is probably flawed. I mean, in terms of the grand scope of time travel movies. What do you think about the time travel? Is it flawed in Back to the Future, or does it kind of only work if you don't think about it too much?
You know what I was gonna say? Sometimes you just have to, shut your brain off and just pretend that everything makes sense. And I mean, Back to the Future isn't a highly intellectual film. It's fun. It's like a fun family adventure kind of ride, you know? You don't have to think too much about it. That being said, I know time travel obviously hasn't been figured out, so it's not an exact science, but yeah, I don't think you need to worry about it. It's a good movie no matter what.
And it's funny because the fact that the film calls itself about time travel, it's all about time travel, but the fact that all of that kind of takes a step back to just, again, the characters, the interactions they have. I mean, Zemeckis probably could have made this film without time travel, and it still would have been like as, funny and exciting, as adventurous as it was. I mean, and Back to the Future has such a huge fan base behind it too, that I'm pretty sure you've taken a picture with a DeLorean at Comic-Con or heard about Back to the Future Day happening in 2015.
It was Back to the Future Day where I was walking in downtown Toronto and they had an exact replica of the time traveling DeLorean and everybody was taking photos. It was the coolest thing.
There's like DeLorean fan groups where like people just park like 30 DeLoreans all in a line and all hang out. And again, there was even rumors back in the 80s when the film came out that hoverboards were real, but the parents wanted them banned, and that there's this big hoax going on that the parents banned hoverboards after Back to the Future came out.
That's really funny.
Or Back to the Future 2 came out.
Yeah.
And I think a big reason why this film is so successful in the grand scope of time travel films is that in a weird way, it invented current pop culture nostalgia. And to me, Back to the Future was a film from 1985 that was able to bring you back to the 50s and live in that time period for a short amount of time before bringing everyone back to the present. But the incredible thing about the film is that it ended up just being a time capsule in itself. Now when we watch it, we get nostalgic for the 80s, the 50s, and what people think the future is going to look like.
Yeah, when like Jaws 27 comes out.
I think it was like Jaws, 14 or 15. And even Steven Spielberg's very tongue-in-cheek about
Exactly.
it. And that's the best part about these films. Back to the Future franchise in itself, it's time travel. The release of the original film is now further away than the time period they went back to. And not only that, but the fact that the writers are so adamant on not having a reboot that it preserves this perfect slice of time travel for years to come. There's this deep fake that went around with like Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland, and they're doing a scene from Back to the Future. Yeah. And everyone was saying, oh, we need a reboot. We need a, alternate dimension, Rick and Morty, they come out of here. The old one still exists.
Those people are wrong, Gorian.
Dead wrong. And luckily, writer Bob Gale has made it super clear that there will never be a reboot for the film.
Good.
And you can only imagine what the studios would want to do with time travel in a reboot for Back to the Future. They'd probably have a CG render of the original actors in the scene and have real life versions interacting with themselves. It would just be a mess. And coming from Bob Gale, we put the end at the end of part 3. Do you think that Back to the Future is more remembered because of the time travel aspects, or the fact that it's just these wonderful, hilarious characters put into this crazy world?
Who are you? My name is Darth Vader.
I think it's a combination of the both. If anything, I want to say it's more so the fact that it's a fun family adventure film. It's just classic. Yeah, you always come back to it and you're like, wow, this still makes me feel like a kid every time I watch this movie.
And it's always nice to have a bit of soft sci-fi too, that again, you can show it to your kids, you show it to your family. Like, Back to the Future might be the perfect film to show anybody if you're wondering what kind of film to show them. Yeah. There really is no wrong answer if you put on Back to the Future. I mean, it's pretty much the perfect film that if it's on cable, I'll sit down and finish the rest of it.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet.
Exactly. They nailed everything from start to finish. Now, I have a question for you, Gorian. It's very clear that this whole movie just has an 80s vibe at its core, right? But what if, and everybody knows the classic time machine DeLorean, what if they didn't go with a DeLorean? What do you think would have happened if they went with, like, a Ford Fiesta?
What would have happened if in the original Back to the Future they didn't have the DeLorean?
Yeah, what if it wasn't a DeLorean? By the way, that's such an 80s idea. Like, hey, let's have a time traveling super cool car, like
Again, and yeah, you're right. It's like a nostalgic time capsule where, again, back then you would think, okay, we need them to travel back in time. What about a cool car they can drive through time with? Have you seen like the H.G. Wells' The Time Machine? It's like a dude pedaling on a bicycle to make it function with like wings and things all over it. Like, again, it's the fact they had fun with it. Like, they didn't have to just have a box that travels back in time. It's a DeLorean, which makes it so cool.
Exactly, yeah.
And following Terminator and Back to the Future, Hollywood saw a wave of time travel films hit theaters from a surplus of genres like Peggy Sue Got Married, Warlock, and the Bill and Ted films. Hollywood realized that it didn't need to focus so much on the how of the time travel and more so just sit back and watch how the characters dealt with it. And that brings us to Groundhog Day.
Not bad, Mr. Connors. You say this is your first lesson?
Yes, but my father was a piano mover, so.
We immediately see a change in what exactly can be considered a time travel movie. And while time jump movies like 13 Going on 30 are a bit hard to argue as a time travel film since they almost always go back to how things were at the beginning of the film,
right.
Groundhog Day lets us travel back to the start of the same day over and over and over again. What do you think about time travel films and time loop films? Do you think that they're kind of a subgenre of one another?
Yeah, I'd say so. That makes sense to me. I'm obviously not a time travel expert. Otherwise, I would have a lot more money. But
And it's the fact that, again, you are traveling back to the beginning of the same day over and over again. That is an amount of time traveled, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say so. And might I add, what a brilliant idea for a film.
Genius.
How great is that? Like, what would a character do in that situation? I have no idea. Let's watch Bill Murray and find out.
We're 2 for 2 with perfect films right now, because despite the fact that Back to the Future and Groundhog Day being time travel movies, they're also 2 perfect films.
Am I right or am I right or am I right? Right.
Yeah.
Groundhog Day is such a good film. And much like Back to the Future, where there's a date every year to revisit the film and watch it, you can't help but seek out Groundhog Day every Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Groundhog Day introduces us to the plot device that is seeing much more increased usage in popular culture, and that's the time loop. We've had a lot of films recently, funny enough, where a person's experiencing the same day over and over again, whether it be a comedy, an action film, or even the new Jordan Peele Twilight Zone had an episode about that.
Right.
It is reaching a max point right now. And the idea that you get to live the same day over and over until you have perfection is really interesting when done correctly. And it also helped that Groundhog Day kept the reason for being stuck in the time loop out of the film. In the second draft, the script actually says Phil's scorned ex-girlfriend Stephanie put the curse on him. After being dumped by Phil, we see Stephanie reading from a magic spell book called 101 Curses, Spells, and Enchantments You Can Do at Home. And in addition to this, she has one of Phil's business cards, and he broke his watch right at 5:59, which is when the day resets.
Right.
Groundhog Day is a great example that you don't always have to use the why in your time travel films.
Yeah.
The fact that this seemingly happens at random to Phil is a big reason why the film works so well. He has absolutely no reason why it's happening or how to make it stop. And not only that, but this is one of the only time travel movies where we can actually feel like the character learned something by time traveling.
This is Dora, Stevie Kleiser, and her fiance Fred. It's Alice. This is Bill. Gus. He hates his life here. He wishes he stayed in the Navy.
So many time travel movies now are about like undoing plots that'll destroy the entire galaxy or world. And it feels like these smaller, more personal stories about time travel are way more enjoyable. We actually get to see him grow bored of entertaining himself and reach out to others and help them out, despite knowing it's going to reset every day.
Right. Exactly.
Do you watch it every year?
You know what? I gotta admit, I don't watch it every year, but I... That's it. I just don't watch it every year.
Well, if you do want to watch it every year, the Royal in Toronto has 3 screenings a day, and you can just buy one ticket and go to all the screenings whenever you want during that day.
That's so awesome.
So many theaters around the world go all in on Groundhog Day, which again, like, they could have made that film called Arbor Day and it still would have been just as successful. I mean, I really don't think that Groundhog Day would be as popular without this film. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
And it's the fact that it's 2 absurd ideas. It's the time travel time loop, and it's the Groundhog Day that we just love so much. And I can't help but think that the original reason for having the spell could have been potentially a good one. I mean, in this film, we really never find out what happens. He basically breaks the curse one day and everything goes back to normal.
Exactly.
And I love the idea of this scorned ex mistakenly trapping him in it. I mean, the fact that like it's like 101, it's like 101 joke book, 101 curses book that she pulls out.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea for having, a supernatural event where, I can't make it stop anymore. It keeps happening no matter what. And I think it really works. Groundhog Day ended up being so universally liked that you actually had people calculating how many days he was in the time loop for, something around 10,000 days.
Yeah.
Sony released a PlayStation VR sequel game where you play his son.
No way. Oh, that's so cool. Goran, I just want to make a quick observation. I feel like, and this is the impression I'm getting so far, but I feel like the 80s were the prime time for good time travel movies. You know what I mean?
They didn't have worlds to save yet, so they were just trying to save themselves in all of these movies. And I think that's what it comes down to. We'll see in later examples with, the Avengers going back in time to save the world and whatnot. But again, speaking of very small time travel movies that I can't help but love, we have Midnight in Paris. Midnight in Paris is an excellent example of why we love certain kinds of time travel movies. And it's so far from other time travel movies in the sense that it actually loves taking you back in time and kind of teaching the audience a little bit about the time period they're going back to. A lot of these older films, time travel was very specific. You're going back to a certain date for historic purposes usually.
Right.
Nowadays, it's more you're going back to the current modern time to fix something.
Right.
But a lot of the reason why people dreamt about time travel was, I want to go back and hunt dinosaurs, you know? That's how far back I want to go. I don't want to go back to last week and stop myself from eating the last piece of cheesecake or something, you know?
Yeah, exactly. There's dinosaurs or cheesecake. You know what, man? I'm not gonna lie. Like, it's a pretty obvious decision.
I think so.
Cheesecake.
And the plot of Midnight in Paris is Owen Wilson gets drunk on the streets of Paris, and at midnight he's invited to a car filled with people dressed as like the 1920s, and he's brought back in time to the 1920s. And the whole film is kind of an allegory about how the time period you're living in now will always be the golden age. Right. And we kind of have a lot of that brought up recently with like nostalgia and remembering the 80s and 90s and things. And the film basically speaks about how you have to be happy with the time period you're currently in, but it's also good to be curious about other time periods. And this isn't a time travel movie. This is a Woody Allen time travel movie that was nominated for Oscars. It won an Academy Award. Like, this is a time travel movie, and it's a fun romantic drama.
Yeah.
I'm from a different time, another era, the future.
You inhabit two worlds. So far, I see nothing strange.
The film goes all in on the magicalness of time travel and instead focuses on telling a story with actual historic figures like F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Pablo Picasso. And you rarely these days get to see time travel used in a historic sense, as it usually is like a plot about, you know, again, stopping the world from devastation.
Yeah.
The great thing about Midnight in Paris is that you do get to meet these real life historic figures that you kind of never really even thought of before you watch the film.
Right.
And the time travel aspect is so minor that it's merely used as a plot device to bring Owen Wilson to the past. But sometimes you really don't care how the characters got there. And some examples later on will be a complete 180, where the entire purpose of the movie is to explain the time travel mechanics. But I really enjoy it when a director is confident enough in their plot that they really don't care about plot holes. And the thing about time travel movies is that there's always a subsection of the community that tries to point out inconsistencies in the logic of made-up time travel. True. Now, sometimes these inconsistencies are just, you know, too painful to ignore. But when the plot is using time travel as a backdrop and doesn't really facilitate itself with the, you know, actual function of the time machine, it's really too pedantic to point them out. And now we're going to go from what I think is the most simplistic time travel movie of all time to the absolute hardest time travel movie to watch.
Oh boy, here we go.
So, have you seen Primer?
I have seen Primer.
How many times have you seen it? Just the once, couple times?
I've only seen it once because I can't absorb the information it's trying to get across. It's so confusing and so complicated. I have no idea how it actually works. I just have faith that it does.
Right. The movie finishes and you go, well, someone else must have understood that for me, you know?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm going to go to Reddit. Check this out.
And the cool thing about Primer is that it holds less weight than what you actually think of. And the way that they use time travel is actually really simplistic, and it's only the plot of Primer that gets so convoluted that's kind of hard to understand. But the actual mechanics are very easy to understand. And Primer itself comes across as fairly complicated because of, again, how realistic it is. The engineers in the film talk not in like fake technobabble like you would see in like a
Star Trek?
Big action movie, but actual physical and like theoretical terms, which it makes it really hard to keep up with the film when they're actually, this isn't just the actors probably had to learn what they were saying because it just sounds like gibberish a lot of the time.
All right, we start the machine with the Weeble at the A end. It runs down parabolically until it should stop, but it doesn't. It curves back around towards the A ends.
Oh, what is so special about 1300?
I curve that around. Okay, now the Weeble has experienced a total of 2 minutes.
The plot itself involves in multiple trips back in time, cornering stock markets, and building backups of backups of backup. But the actual time travel mechanics make perfect sense. Okay, are you ready for me to explain it to you?
I am so ready. Shower me with knowledge, Gorian. I want it.
Nick was shaking his head no while he said that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the thing with Primer is that it plays up the notion that if you even think about time travel, it exists.
Gorian, you already lost me.
So the device in Primer works like this. The original first person to use the device turns on a delayed switch on the box, and the box is big enough for you to lie down inside. And because since you know that you're going to get in the box at the end of the day, you already know what's happening and is happening. So you turn on the delayed switch and leave the area so that the double you can come out of the box, because running into your double self is really...
Yeah.
You can see your double self from a distance and stuff, but if you ever interact with them, it's very
Bad
clustery
vibes.
for the time-space continuum.
Bad vibes, bro.
So you turn on the delayed switch and leave the area so that the double can exit the device. The original will check stock prices and whatever information they want to bring back with them to the start of the day. At the end of the day, around 6 p.m., the original will then enter the box device, and then you have to wait the subjective amount of time to go back in time. So if you want to go back in time 6 hours, you have to sit in the box for 6 hours.
Right.
And the machine can only travel back in time to when it was turned on. So you have the delayed switch that it turns on when you're not in the room, and after 6 hours, the original, who is now the double, leaves the machine 6 hours earlier, slightly after the original turned on the machine and left. So for the machine to work, you basically have a double version of yourself for the day, but you end up going into the box at the end of the day and you become your own double. So the original existence is to enter the box, and it's basically an infinite closed loop. You know you're going to get into the box at the end of the day, so you turn it on and leave, the double leaves, and yeah, you just have to go into the box because since you came out, you know you're going into the box.
Right, okay.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how much did this make sense?
Absolutely none of it, I'm not gonna lie. The most impressive part for me is that they've made a movie with a time machine that you can actually take a nap in, like one of those sleeping pods. I think that's kind of cool, but aside from the tech, I had no idea what's going on.
There's a great sketch with Bob and David on Netflix where they have time machines, but it only moves forward in time at regular speed. And funny enough, that's literally the exact same thing as Primer, but in reverse. Primer is basically you have to wait reverse time and then you can get out and do your own thing.
Right.
And there's tons and tons of actual diagrams, because again, the actual time travel mechanic is fairly simple to understand, but they start doing backups, triple doubles, backups of backups. It gets really convoluted really fast. So it's one of those films where, again, you need a couple viewings and a couple Wikipedia tabs open.
Yeah, I can only watch this movie with like a PhD, like somebody with a doctorate in the room, so you can explain it to me as I watch. Yeah. Real life commentary.
The reason we love Primer is that it's a movie that goes, oh, you want to take time travel seriously? Are you sure you want that? It's uninhibited in its sense of explaining a proper time travel device. We love to blindly believe time travel plots in some movies because it's the characters that we are watching for. But Primer takes it a step further to really think about all aspects of time travel and to portray it as real as possible. If you look up articles talking about realistic time travel mechanics, a big one is that you cannot travel back in time to a time where the time machine wasn't even built. It relates back to the idea that time machine is basically already set in motion and you can't bring it back to when it wasn't invented. And even in Primer, technically the first time he fires up the machine, he wouldn't have to leave the room, right? If the first time you're using the time machine to get in at the end of the day, you wouldn't have to leave the room because you technically haven't gone in the machine at the end of the day yet on the timeline you're on.
Right.
But you've also have...
My brain no longer exists.
I want to watch Back to the Future again.
Yeah, give me Doc Brown.
Whoa, this is heavy.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
I'm not gonna lie, hearing you talk about this makes me want to watch Primer again because it's been a few years and I kind of want to go back and see how they approached time travel. Because as far as I know, Primer is one of the only few movies to have done what it has. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it really is like a plot holeless film because it was created in the sense that it would be 100% accurate. I mean, in the sense that of where people are and when they're coming in and out. I mean, again, at the end of the day, who knows if we can time travel or not.
Right.
But Primer, they really, really, really wanted to make it as accurate as possible. It's incredible that they would have alienated so many people from watching this movie because of how complicated it is. And they weren't even worried about that. They understood that there were people out there that love time travel movies like this, where even science fiction films, where they want to make it as realistic as possible in our world. And I think that's why we love it. I mean, a lot of people might put off Primer because it's really a tough watch for those unaware. And it really is a film that I think requires a bit of research and subsequent viewings to fully grasp the actual plot of the film. In reality, the time travel in Primer is just, it's pretty simple, but it's only later on in the film that is introduced fail-safes and backup fail-safes, and that basically there's people potentially sitting in this time machine for an entire week just to go back in time that far.
It's also complicated.
But speaking of movies that were pretty scientifically spot on, we have probably one of the biggest in most recent years in terms of just how many scientists were actually talking about this movie.
Yeah.
What movie is it, Nick?
Oh, it is Interstellar by Christopher Nolan.
Interstellar. And Interstellar is a great time travel movie because not only does it actually deal with time travel mechanics like bootstrap paradoxes, but it also deals with the all too real fact that you age much slower in space than down on Earth. And the plot of Interstellar, they go out, they try and find another planet to bring humanity onto, or find another place to send their ship that we can all live on forever.
Right.
And the way the film was set up, this allowed for some fantastic sequences where traditionally aged characters get to reunite at a cluster of different ages. And time travel doesn't specifically designate changing your location, but can also be considered something that can age us. I mean, I bet you that there's a Twilight Zone episode where there's a time travel machine that just basically ages someone super fast and they die, you know?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Time travel doesn't just mean going back to a certain date, but it could also mean the actual time that we perceive it and how we travel through that time.
Oh, Gorian, I'm going to blow your mind right now. Are you ready?
Yeah.
We are time traveling right now.
You look up at the stars at night?
Yeah.
Yep, that's time travel. That's 7 minutes in the past you're looking at, man. And again, that's one of those things where this movie will start to make you think about things like that, where, you know, the sun, it takes 7 minutes for light to hit the earth, so we're technically always looking at the past when we look up at the sky.
Isn't that crazy?
All of these things can count as time travel.
Yeah, it's so wild. And it's way too complicated for my tiny human brain to understand, but...
Well, Interstellar also plays so much with the fact that, like, with this rapid aging stuff, I mean, even amongst the teammates, we saw it affect them.
I've waited years. How many years? I know it must be.
It's 23 years.
While visiting Miller's planet, every hour spent on the planet is 7 years on Earth. Ooh. And there's even irony in the time travel, as the positive beacon that led them to Miller's was also affected by the time delay. A positive beacon sent out immediately, followed by the death of the sender by a wave, meant the signal was just massively delayed.
Yeah. That's honestly really interesting. You know what my favorite thing to come out of that scene in Interstellar?
What?
It's all those memes where it's like, oh, 1 hour here is 7 years on Earth. And then it cuts to, oh, this will be the perfect place to wait for, I don't know, Half-Life 3. You know what I mean?
Yeah, somewhere where like time goes really quickly. Or I guess like they would also have memes where it's like, I'm at the DMV. 1 hour here is 7 hours outside of the DMV, you know?
So true.
And we even have the interactions with them at the end of the film where, you know, Matthew McConaughey's meeting his daughter, but the daughter's, you know,
older than him.
50 years older than him.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Oh, it's so insane to think about. It hurts my head, but I love it.
And I mentioned earlier the Bootstrap Paradox, and it's when a time travel movie will use the time travel to send important information from the future to the past. And we've seen this in films like The Terminator, but The Terminator shot themselves in the foot by not only having time travel, but multiple retcons and redos that the time travel mechanics are the least of the Terminator's worries. I mean, it was at one point considered one of the best time travel movies, and it still is, but as a franchise, my God, it just got stickier and stickier.
Yeah. Time was not kind to Terminator.
In the beginning of the film, we see a ghost Cooper using the Tesseract from the end of the film to communicate with his daughter Murph in the room. We then see Coop relay information collected by TARS to a young Murph and basically saving humanity. And we have another example of something a bit closer to realistic time travel, but again, it's achieved by jumping into wormholes and using the power of love to connect and communicate with people. Right. It's a strong mix of both the physical and the metaphysical, and while some people argue that the feelings and the emotion part takes away from the actual science at play, I really do think that both are needed for the conclusion of the film, with Coop flying through the crazy fifth dimension, telling his, you know, younger daughter information. And it's also a unique time travel movie in the fact that we get to see what traveling through time actually feels like and looks like. Usually movies will just have like swirling lights and, whooshing sounds, but Interstellar tried to show what it would actually look like to be in the fifth dimension and have the ability to talk with the past.
Yeah. It was brilliantly done, and I don't know how they envisioned it. It was so good.
And you can find so many articles online about scientists talking about the wormhole scene and just how incredibly, like, in terms of like science fiction, like real science in fiction work, like Interstellar is an incredible movie. And again, if you ever saw it on IMAX on those massive screens, those wormhole sequences were, it's gonna sound corny, but out of this world.
Oh, that was good. That was good.
No one likes it when someone points out something in a film just because it's an overlooked plot hole. We get it. We don't understand how the T-Rex came out of the forest in Jurassic Park only for it to become a leap of death. And the same is true with time travel movies. Spending too much time picking apart why a time travel movie doesn't work will only grow you to resent and dislike the film, and not see all the charming qualities it has to offer. But sometimes a movie centers itself on time travel and takes itself so seriously that you can't ignore all the flaws that are right in front of you.
But that was just one little insignificant mosquito. That can't change the future, right? Right?
So a film titled after the phenomena of time travel itself. Nick, what is the butterfly effect? Not the film, but, the butterfly effect. What is it?
Oh, it's the idea, or I don't know, I guess a theory that, say, a butterfly flaps its wings in Australia. Somehow that can relate to, I don't know, something exploding in like space,
huge changes.
Yeah.
The shorthand is the butterfly effect. A butterfly can flap its wings in Peking, and in Central Park you get rain instead of sunshine.
I'll be a butterfly. How come? Because nobody ever suspects the butterfly.
It's often brought up with chaos theory and vice versa, and it basically implies small changes have huge ramifications. And that's totally true. And unlike in Back to the Future, where changing the past might only erase you from a photo, the concept of the butterfly effect suggests that instead the future would be like incredibly different after the smallest of changes. And the plot of the butterfly effect is basically Ashton Kutcher finds himself being able to go back in time by reading childhood journals. He can transport himself and relive the moments.
Right.
And he ends up killing his sister's boyfriend by mistake and is sent to prison. And he convinces a religious prisoner to help him recover his journal by using a childhood drawing to return to the past, stab himself in the hand, and then return to the present and show the religious guy and say, look at that, I didn't have holes in my hands before, now I do, right? And the scars magically appear on his hands, and I know we are becoming those nitpickers, but there's no way. That's not how butterfly effect works in the slightest. The idea of the butterfly effect is that whatever changes you make would be lifelong. So stabbing himself in the hand to create scars would mean he entered prison with those scars already, meaning that he basically walked up to a guy and told him he could make scars appear on his hands while already having the scars. It basically contradicts itself, where, again, if you went back in time and pierced his hands as a kid, he has those scars his entire life. It wouldn't just fade in after a couple of seconds. With Back to the Future, we can kind of agree that, if you fade out of a family photo, why was the family posed around a weird missing gap in the middle? Yeah. It doesn't matter. It's Back to the Future,
Yeah, I don't think about it. It's not a big deal.
Versus this is a film that prides itself on, again, the butterfly effect, and it got it wrong in its own movie. It's just painful.
Yeah.
What the f*** is this?
As a film that seems to want to pride itself on this time travel phenomena, it seems rightly fair to take a look at the plot itself to say that it doesn't make any sense at all. Ashton should have tried to discover something about this person he was trying to prove his powers to through one way or another, or, even knowing that he could have sent the prisoner down a set of events that maybe didn't lead him to prison. I mean, again, the whole point of the butterfly effect is that if he went back in time and pierced his hand, he should have gone back to the present and it would have been, Armageddon for some reason.
Yeah.
Do you think that flaws like this in a time travel heavy film can be overlooked? Or do you think that this is just egregious, the fact that they would make, a plot hole this big in their film?
Yeah, it's really funny that being called the butterfly effect, it got its own, science wrong. Sometimes, depending on the movie, it's easy to look over. You just want to sit in for the ride. It's a movie. At the end of the day, it's a movie. But I will be the first to admit that if I watch a movie and it doesn't make sense, or I'm clearly calling it out for being so stupid that even I notice it.
Like, it's unavoidable.
Yeah, then, like, it totally pulls you out of the experience. And to me, it's like, okay, well, why am I watching this garbage, you know?
Exactly. If the fact that you can't even get your own mechanics correct, why should I bother watching the rest of this movie?
Exactly.
I didn't burn down the school. It was the butterfly, I tell you. The butterfly.
And this leads us to another movie that does a good mix of both, and it's Looper. Looper's a great film because even in the film itself, Bruce Willis warns us not to think about time travel too much, or else it'll just look like scribbles on a napkin.
I don't want to talk about time travel. Because if we start talking about it, then we're going to be here all day talking about it, making diagrams with straws.
And while it's humorous for them to discuss how the mechanics of it work, I feel like too many movies these days will insert a line of dialogue proclaiming how insane the situation is, and they just get to go on with it. You know, it's kind of like the fact that they point out how lazy their writing is doesn't cover up the fact that the writing is lazy. You go, oh, well, that was convenient. Oh, well, that, I can't stand it.
Yeah.
And the biggest beef with Looper is that they often run into something called the grandfather paradox. And it's a very popular trope in time travel media. And American philosopher David Lewis explained the grandfather paradox in 1976, and it is 100% applicable to Looper. So in Looper, the future, it's hard to hide bodies, so mafia send people back in time to kill targets at a younger age. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, Joe, is a looper and is sent back to kill someone and discovers it's his future self, played by Bruce Willis.
Right.
And this creates the grandfather paradox in this film. So the paradox is there's a young man named Tim who goes back in time to 1921 to kill his bad grandpa. And he has two choices. He goes back and he can either kill him or he doesn't kill him. And the original 1921 is the grandpa growing up and the grandson not killing him.
Right.
And the grandson traveling to 1921 to kill him is the new 1921, since it's the first instance of him traveling back to the 1921. So you have the original and you have the new one.
Right.
But the paradox goes, if he does kill his grandpa, he would be killing him in both old and new 1921 at the same time, which is basically logically impossible. And again, it's like Primer, where it's like a perfect loop where you would never have that original 1921 if time travel was real, because it would always be the timeline you kill your grandpa, if that's what you chose to do.
Yeah.
Continuous loop. Looper suggests that there are ways to go back to a time period and create a new timeline that is uninfluenced by all other attempts at time travel to that point. But much like Primer, it's a never-ending loop of choosing to do time travel. The fact that the loopers go back in time and kill people before they can get older to cause the problems they are being killed for introduces the idea that killing them while young and innocent before they were old and guilty will completely change the outcome of all the events from that point on. And this only seems to come up at the very end of the film, where the final decision is to kill or not kill someone, and that creates like a new timeline.
Yeah.
What is your take on changing the future in time travel movies? So many of these films will say that once something's set in motion, you can't really stop yourself from doing it. And what ends up happening in these time travel movies is that you find out your actions trying to stop it cause it to come full circle, So no matter what, it's always a self-occurring, prophecy.
Exactly. And I mean, to me, again, with my limited knowledge of time travel, that's kind of how I see it.
Exactly, especially when it's something that comes down to just making a different choice, where it's a character. You can go back and choose not to shoot him, you can choose to shoot him this time. Yeah. And the second you make your choice, it was predetermined by that point. And again, anytime you basically involve time travel, it's, self-reoccurring. It's always going to happen. Yeah. And it's why it's so hard to talk about sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah, Gorian, I'm going to be honest with you. So my biggest gripe with Looper isn't the fact that, like the movie exists or anything, but it's that I don't think Bruce Willis looks very much like Joseph Gordon-Levitt. That is my biggest issue.
Even with all the nose prosthetics?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, when that movie came out, people were like applauding it for how similar they looked, and I honestly was always just like, really? Aren't they supposed to be like 15 years apart in the movie or something? Like they're not that old in the movie. Like,
that's crazy.
They should have just time traveled Bruce Willis.
Exactly.
Time travel has not been invented yet, but in 30 years it will be. My name is Elmer Fudd, and I'm a whooper.
So moving on from, infinite loops, we have Avengers End Game. And not every movie that has time travel in it is solely a time travel movie. And it seems like these days, a lot of franchises are attempting to tie up some loose ends by incorporating time travel and fixing things.
Yep.
I know a lot of people thought the third Star Wars film was going to try and do some sort of time travel thing to fix its plot, but even that couldn't save it.
I feel like a lot of fans would be very upset if that happened.
Oh, or technically happier now.
Yeah, or you know what? Actually, that could go both ways.
If only we had a time machine.
That's a very good point.
The thing with films doing this is that you inevitably end up reading some comments online that point out the flaw in the time travel, and dang it, you just can't ignore it. It also creates a sense of dread in the entire franchise because once time travel is introduced into a franchise, you can't help but feel that they could always fall back on it if needed.
Yeah.
What about the reality we left behind? The answer is don't think about it. It's not like we can do this every week anyways. We get 3 or 4 more of these tops.
And so the time travel in Endgame is actually pretty neat. And when they originally shot the time travel scenes, they actually had no idea what the costumes were going to look like ahead of time. And it kind of sounds like the same with the time travel plot. So we have Thanos being defeated by going back in time and we kick his butt. And they discovered that going back in time changes things and creates a splinter universe, a different universe than our own. Mm-hmm. And if you want to go back in time to 1994 and told your friend to invest in Apple stock, when you return to the present, nothing would be changed, and instead that universe would be going in a new direction.
Oh, I see, yeah.
The one confusing thing is that they use quantum realm to be able to jump back to the same dimension / timeline where they came from.
Yeah.
And it also doesn't help that Robert Downey Jr. invented time machine in a day and a half in that film.
Oh man, it took him 30 seconds, I swear.
It happened way too fast.
Yeah.
The film ends with Captain America going back to put the stones where they found them, only to discover that afterwards he went back in time to spend his life with Peggy.
Yeah.
And this is, super emotional and it's a nice ending, but it brings up questions like the purpose of putting the stones back where they found them specifically in the universe was that so they could return to their own timeline unaffected. They wanted to put everything back as it were and then basically have it all kind of sort itself out.
Yeah, oh no, Gorian, don't tell me this. You're going to ruin the movie for me.
So some people say that when Steve goes back in time and stays in his timeline, is that creating a splinter universe where he wouldn't have met the rest of the Avengers at the end of that film? I mean, it's the fact that he's making such a big change to this universe that it would have just done a huge ripple effect. If you think about it, when he goes back in time to stay with Peggy, there's still technically the Captain America that's frozen in the block of ice that will come out when they make the first Avengers movie. But does that mean it's a closed loop, or does that just ruin the time travel in it? I can't tell if this is good time travel or not. What's your take on this?
That's true. Gorian, just listening to you explain that to me it makes me sad because I had faith in the mechanics of Endgame, but I don't know. Now you're just pointing out some flaws. It doesn't make sense. You're right. I think when you look deeper, the way that they time travel just doesn't make sense.
It happened way too fast. And again, it really did feel a little bit like a slap in the face where we have this franchise building up for so long that time travel is meant it's like whiteout. You only use it when you really, really need to.
Right,
because time travel basically implies you didn't know where your plot was going and you basically should have made these fixes a couple of years ago. So you're using time travel to fix it.
Exactly.
And even then, I remember watching this film in the theaters when they were doing the time travel mechanics. And I remember thinking to myself, all right, I have no idea what, if it's multiverse, what type, and the fact that it was so unexpectedly introduced to, where all of a sudden I have to learn how the time travel works in the Marvel, cinematic universe all of a sudden.
Yeah. Does it bother you being a fan of Marvel movies that essentially they've added time travel and now everything else could essentially not matter? I feel like there's no point now to everything else.
We did have the fact that there's Doctor Strange who was telling them that there's only one world or one universe or one outcome they have where they can save everybody.
Right.
The thing with introducing time travel into the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that you're right. They can always fall back on it. The Marvel Universe always has the joke that people don't really die because the amount of times they bring them back. And it kind of feels like they have they have Doctor Strange who can also time travel. They invented it so they can always fall back on it. But also, I've been hearing rumors that the DCEU is going to try try and do an incredibly massive reboot with Flash Paradox.
Yeah.
Multiverse, saga movie where they're introducing old and new Batman. And again, you see them trying to save a franchise with time travel, and it never works. It's always so complicated.
Exactly.
The audience doesn't want to be confused. I think that's the reason why Back to the Future is such a good movie and Groundhog Day is such a good movie. It's that we don't want to have to be thinking about these things. Like, we really don't want to have to do any homework while we're at the movie theaters,
Yeah, I just want to shut my brain off and, relax. That's it.
Exactly. And again, I'll shut my brain off at a lot of things, but the second you say time travel, I don't know what to think about. It just seems lazy to me.
100%. I'm the same way. As soon as I wake up in the morning, bam, brain off. And then as soon as I go to bed, brain off, But I agree. I totally agree. We've gotten to that point now where I guess the only way to unwrite time travel is to time travel, I guess. And anyway, I think it's here to stay. I also think it's the only way that they're going to be able to incorporate Fantastic Four, the X-Men. So, I mean, I'm sure there were reasons for it, but I guess the science could have been better.
What do we think about films that introduce time travel unexpectedly? I mean, do you think that we might get like a James Bond movie where they'll be like, Mr. Bond, step into my chamber, if you will, and he like gets turned into a baby or something?
I'm not gonna lie, I want to see that Bond movie. It depends. Again, I don't know. Like, I don't love it, especially the example that sticks out in my mind is Avengers End Game. Again, I thought it was a fun ride, but
we've seen it in films with, X-Men Days of Future Past.
Oh, don't even talk to me about X-Men.
Movie.
Do not talk to me about X-Men. I cannot stand what they did with that franchise, and I want it to burn. I can't. I hate it.
They had one great time travel movie, and then they just did more time travel randomness that just made it so incredibly hard to follow.
Yeah.
That one standalone time travel movie was freaking great.
Yeah.
Again, ruined franchise.
I hear you. Exactly. There is such a thing as overdoing time travel, and I think that's the problem, is that it shouldn't be used as a crutch. It's more of a tool that you use very, very wisely.
Basically, if it's not the plot of the entire movie and you're bringing it in, I'm going to roll my eyes first, no matter what, and then you can argue having it in your property. Do you think we'll ever see time travel?
To be honest with you, 100%. I think we'll get there one day.
We're in a closed loop right now. It's going to happen.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. What about you?
I think that there will definitely be some sort of thing that, it won't be time travel, but they'll be zapping, particles and protons and sending them back to like the opposite side of the room. And I do think it'll be a long time before we get any sort of travel backwards in time. And again, Stephen Hawking was saying that when we do invent time machines, if we do, we'll only be able to go back in time to the point of the time machine's creation.
Right.
You can't go back in time to when something was uncreated because you wouldn't have built it. And again, closed loops, grandfather paradoxes, bootstrap paradoxes.
Yeah.
Time travel is super hard, and it feels like the best films are the ones where you don't have to think about them too hard.
Exactly. I have a question for you, Gorian. Given what you just said, I understand what you're talking about, but do you think that there might be a chance that we've already been visited by time travelers?
That is a fantastic idea. Have we been visited by time travelers? I'll say yes. I think so. I'll say yes just because I want movies like Back to the Future to actually exist in our world. I want to go to Comic-Con. I want to get in that DeLorean. I want to punch in a date for 2015. And again, the fact that the Back to the Future date that they go to is now also in the past for us, and it's their future, I don't think I'll ever get over that.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy, yeah.
Hopefully, we've got some even more time travel goodness from the DCEU when they try to recreate the multiverse. We've seen from the films today that time travel is a concept that radically changes depending on who is using it and for what purpose. Humans are obsessed with the idea of fixing our errors and changing our past, and we're obsessed about the movies that do that. Time travel movies range so wildly and are equally beloved for different reasons. Whether it's a time travel movie that literally travels you to a different time period to experience, or just the idea of building a time travel machine is enough of a concept to carry a film. We've seen it save franchises, destroy others, and introduce us to some of the most unique and interesting plots in film history. Speaking of time travel, if our listeners want to find you in the future, Nick, where can they find you?
Oh, that's an excellent question. You can find me online anywhere at Nick the Sound Grip, or you can find my show Did Somebody Say Movies at DSSM_podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to crawl into my time machine box for 6 hours as I read the plot summary of Primer again. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Subscribe and leave a like, and check us out on Spotify if you're on the go. What's your favorite time travel tale? Mine will forever be Hot Tub Time Machine. Great White Buffalo.